In December 2022, the United States federal government ordered Epic Games to pay $520 million, not as a part of a lawsuit settlement they could spin. This was a formal penalty for illegally collecting data from children and for deliberately engineering their menus to trick their own players into spending money they didn't intend to spend. $500 million, the largest fine in the entire history of the FTC. And here's the thing that should bother you. After they wrote that check, Epic's monetization didn't slow down, it accelerated. But before we get to what happened after the fine, we need to answer a more fundamental question. Is Fortnite and Epic Games a company that made mistakes, or is it predatory behavior? Today, we're tearing down the bright, colorful facade to expose the corporate machinery running behind the scenes. Because this isn't a story about a video game. This is a documentary about a multi-billion-dollar corporation that built its empire on the back of an exhausted, severely overworked staff. It's a story about the weaponization of child psychology, the implementation of predatory dark patterns, and a company that was legally penalized for tricking its own audience. This is the side of Fortnite that Epic desperately hopes you ignore. To understand the dark side of Fortnite, we have to go back to 2018. The Battle Royale mode had just exploded. It was making hundreds of millions of dollars a month. But to keep the player base engaged, Epic Games introduced something that would completely change the industry: the constant update cycle. They promised new weapons, new map changes, and new cosmetics every week. From a player's perspective, it was a golden age of gaming content. But from a dev perspective, it was a living nightmare. In the gaming industry, there's a term called crunch. It refers to periods of intense, mandatory overtime that devs endure to finish a game before its release date. Usually, crunch lasts a few weeks or months, and then the game ships and the team rests. But Fortnite wasn't a normal game. It was a live service platform. There was no final release date. There was only the next patch. Epic Games effectively created an environment of infinite crunch. In 2019, an investigative report by Polygon blew the lid off the working conditions inside Epic's North Carolina headquarters. The details were horrifying. Employees were working 70, 80, and even 100-hour work weeks. They were sleeping under their desks. They were missing family events, sacrificing their health, and experiencing severe burnout just to ensure a new assault rifle or a map change was ready for the next Thursday update. The corporate culture of Fortnite during this time was described as highly toxic. While management officially stated that the overtime was voluntary, the reality on the floor was completely different. Contractors, who made up a massive portion of the quality assurance and testing teams, lived in constant fear. If they didn't work the grueling weekend hours, they knew their contracts wouldn't be renewed. The unspoken rule was simple: keep your body in the seat, or someone else will take your place. In fact, one developer described the atmosphere as a state of perpetual fear. Because the game was making so much money, executives were scared of slowing down. If a patch had a bug, employees were pulled out of bed in the middle of the night to fix it immediately. The executives at the top were becoming billionaires, while the people actually building the game were suffering from stress-induced health issues. Epic eventually recognized the PR disaster this report caused and claimed they were taking steps to fix the work-life balance. They said they introduced mandated company-wide breaks, but the damage was done, and the foundation of Fortnite's explosive success was forever stained by the severe human costs it required to build. The workers paid the price for building the empire, but once the empire was built, Epic needed a way to monetize it. And the system they designed to do that psychologically took advantage of all sorts of children. Fortnite is a free-to-play game, which means 100% of its revenue relies on microtransactions. So let's talk about V-Bucks. On the surface, a premium digital currency seems normal. Every game has it now, but the entire purpose of V-Bucks is a psychological concept called decoupling. When you look at a new Batman skin in the item shop, the game doesn't tell you it costs $20. It tells you it costs 2,000 V-Bucks. By converting real-world money into imaginary coins, Epic completely disconnects the player's brain from the concept of financial value. It's actually the exact same psychology used by casinos with poker chips. It doesn't feel like you're spending real money. It feels like you're spending game points. But Epic took this a step further. They implemented a rotating daily item shop. If you see a skin you want, a countdown timer tells you it's leaving in a few hours. And this creates a massive sense of FOMO. The game is constantly whispering to the player, buy it now, or you might never see it again. For years, the Fortnite item shop utilized what consumer protection agencies called dark patterns. These are deliberate design choices engineered to trick users into doing things they didn't intend to do. In Fortnite, the button to preview a cosmetic item was placed very close to the button to purchase it. Furthermore, for a long time, there was no confirm purchase screen. If your finger slipped and you pressed the wrong button on your controller, the V-Bucks were instantly drained from your account. There was no "are you sure" prompt. It was an instant, non-refundable transaction. And this wasn't an accident or a coding error. This was a deliberate UI choice designed to capitalize on accidental clicks, especially from children who didn't fully understand how the menu worked. Millions of V-Bucks were drained from accounts worldwide due to simple misclicks. And when parents realized their credit cards were being charged for these accidental purchases and tried to issue chargebacks through their banks, Epic Games responded with hostility. If a parent reversed a charge, Epic would permanently ban the child's entire Fortnite account, locking them out of all the legitimate items they had previously bought. Epic was essentially saying, accept the fraudulent charge or lose everything you've ever paid for. This highly aggressive, borderline extortionate behavior wasn't just unethical. As the United States government eventually determined, it was actually highly illegal. And the government's response to all of this? That's where the $500 million comes in. But before we get to the fine, there's one more chapter of the corporate manipulation that happened in between. And it might be the craziest thing Fortnite has ever done. If the FTC lawsuit showed how Epic treats its players, The Project Liberty campaign showed how Epic treats its business partners and its own fanbase. It proved that behind the consumer-friendly branding lies a cold corporate machine that knows exactly how to manipulate the public narrative. In August 2020, Epic Games initiated one of the most aggressive and manipulative corporate maneuvers in tech history. They openly declared war on Apple and Google. For years, Apple and Google had taken a standard 30% cut for all digital purchases made on their mobile app stores. Tim Sweeney, the CEO of Epic, absolutely hated this. He believed the 30% platform tax was monopolistic, unfair, and a massive drain on dev profits. So Epic decided to weaponize the entire Fortnite player base. They executed a carefully planned operation internally codenamed Project Liberty. On the morning of August 13th, 2020, Epic rolled out a sudden hotfix to the mobile versions of Fortnite. This update introduced the Epic Direct payment system, offering players an immediate 20% discount on V-Bucks if they bypassed Apple and Google's payment systems and paid Epic directly. Obviously, they knew what they were doing. This wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate violation of the App Store terms of service. They fully expected to be banned from both platforms. In fact, they actively wanted to be banned. They needed the ban to happen to trigger the next phase of their plan. Within hours, Apple did exactly what Epic expected and removed Fortnite off the App Store. Google followed shortly after, and Epic's response was instant. The very second the ban happened, Epic's legal team filed a massive, pre-written 60-page antitrust lawsuit against Apple. But they didn't stop at the courts. They launched a massive multimedia propaganda campaign aimed directly at their young, impressionable audience. They aired a cinematic short inside Fortnite called 1980 Fortnite, a direct parody of Apple's famous 1984 commercial. The short portrayed Apple as an evil dictator with a glowing screen for a face, controlling the mindless masses. And look, there's something a little ironic about this creative choice, because this is a company that had just spent years deliberately engineering menus to trick children into accidental purchases, and they decided to cast themselves as a lone rebel fighting against corporate mind control. They used their own propaganda film to complain about propaganda. Then, at the end of the video, text appeared on the screen urging players to join the fight and use the hashtag #FreeFortnite on social media. They took a dispute over corporate profit margins and framed it as a righteous crusade for open platforms and developer freedom. Tim Sweeney portrayed himself as a modern-day revolutionary fighting for the little guy. But the hypocrisy was staggering. While Tim Sweeney was preaching about the evils of monopolies and closed ecosystems on mobile, the Epic Games Store on PC was aggressively doing the exact same thing. They were spending hundreds of millions of dollars buying up exclusive rights to independent games and actively preventing them from being sold on rival platforms like Steam. Epic was furious that Apple had a monopoly on iOS, but they were perfectly fine spending massive amounts of cash to create their own artificial monopolies on PC. So Epic Games, a multi-billion-dollar corporation backed by the tech conglomerate Tencent, was actively trying to brainwash millions of teenagers into acting as their private PR army. They wanted kids to harass Apple on Twitter and TikTok because Epic wanted to keep more money. The trial eventually happened, and the judge ultimately ruled that Apple was not an illegal monopolist, dealing a massive blow to Epic's grand narrative. The legal campaign failed, the propaganda campaign failed, and Epic walked away, having disrupted millions of mobile players' experiences for no reason except for having to pay a large legal bill. All of that reckless spending on a failed legal war was going somewhere, and the bill was about to come due in a very specific, very public way. In December of 2022, the Federal Trade Commission, the US government agency responsible for protecting consumers, formally brought the hammer down. They charged Epic Games with violating the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, better known as COPPA, and using highly deceptive practices to trick players into making unintended purchases. The resulting settlement wasn't a slap on the wrist. It was the largest administrative penalty in the entire history of the FTC. Epic Games was ordered to pay a staggering $520 million for their Fortnite transactions. Now, let's break down exactly what that $500 million represents, because when you look at the court filings, it proves just how dark the company's back-end practices really were. The first part of the penalty was a $275 million fine for blatantly violating COPPA. For context, COPPA is a strict federal law designed to keep children safe online. The FTC discovered that Epic Games had been illegally collecting personal data from children under the age of 13 without ever obtaining verifiable consent from their parents. And they weren't just gathering basic game stats, they were collecting names, email addresses, and location data from minors. But it gets much worse. Epic automatically enabled real-time voice and text chat for everyone by default, including children. The FTC's investigation revealed a scary reality. Because these communication channels were left wide open, kids were actively being exposed to bullying, violent threats, and harassment from adult strangers online. And this wasn't a glitch or an oversight, it was a conscious corporate decision. The legal filings revealed that Epic's own employees had repeatedly raised internal alarms about the safety risks. Devs actively warned management that the default voice chat was putting kids in danger, but the executives completely ignored them. The FTC noted that Epic actually pushed back against adding a simple toggle button to turn the chat off. But why did they do that? Because they didn't want to hurt the game's engagement metrics. They prioritized the social virality of the platform over the basic safety of the minors playing it. The second part of the massive penalty was a $245 million refund pool. This money was dedicated entirely to paying back the millions of users who were scammed by the dark patterns we talked about before. The FTC's official complaint was a damning indictment of Epic's corporate ethics. The government explicitly stated that Epic deployed a variety of deceptive interfaces aimed directly at children and teenagers. They They documented how the game lacked a basic confirm purchase button for years. They pointed out how the preview item button was placed very close to the buy button. There were even cases where players would try to wake the game up from sleep mode, press a button on their controller to turn the screen on, and instantly be charged for whatever item happened to be on the screen. And then the government formally called out Epic's most aggressive tactic, purposely locking the accounts of players who tried to dispute the shady charges. If a parent saw hundreds of dollars in unauthorized V-Buck purchases on their credit card and called their bank to reverse the charge, Epic would instantly retaliate. They would permanently ban the player's account. Epic was essentially holding digital accounts hostage. Either you pay for these fraudulent accidental charges, or we will permanently delete every single legitimate skin, emote, and battle pass your child has ever earned. It was digital extortion. When a company is forced to pay over $500 million specifically because they engineered their menus to trick children into spending their parents' money, you can no longer argue that they're just a fun, innocent gaming studio. This wasn't an honest mistake. They were operating a highly predatory digital storefront, and they only changed their user interface when the federal government threatened to tear them apart in federal court. So here's what you'd expect to happen next. The fine lands, the press coverage is brutal, Epic quietly cleans up their UI, scales back the aggressive monetization, and rebuilds some goodwill with their player base. That is not what happened. After being forced to pay $500 million and having the federal government publicly call them out for tricking children, Epic didn't slow down their monetization. They actually accelerated it. In late 2023, right alongside the news that hundreds of devs were losing their livelihoods, which we'll get to in a moment, Epic quietly dropped another announcement. They were increasing the real-world price of V-Bucks across the United States, Europe, Canada, and several major global regions. The corporate justification was standard PR speak. They blamed the price hike on economic factors like inflation and currency fluctuations. Now, on the surface, inflation is a very real thing, but when you stop and think about it for more than 2 seconds, applying the logic of real-world inflation to an artificial digital currency is a massive slap in the face to the consumer. They needed a quick cash injection to compensate for the self-inflicted financial losses the executives had caused to their failed metaverse investments, massive legal bills, and that $500 million federal fine. But raising the price of the virtual coins was only step 1. Step 2 was changing how much the items inside the shop actually cost. Around the exact same time, Epic began aggressively pushing the cosmetic market into an entirely new pricing tier. When they introduced Rocket Racing and Fortnite Festival, the item shop underwent a massive shift. Suddenly, you weren't just buying a fun outfit for 1,200 V-Bucks. The game started selling digital car chassis and virtual musical instruments. If you wanted a specific virtual car to drive in a minigame, it would cost you 2,500 or even 4,000 V-Bucks. We started seeing bundles hitting the item shop that equated to $30 or $40. That's nearly the price of a whole new standalone video game, all packed into a single cosmetic purchase inside a free-to-play title. They effectively gentrified their own item shop. Epic's financial analysts realized a very profitable truth. The player base was aging up. The young kids who were begging their parents for a $10 skin back in 2018 were now young adults in 2023 and 2024. They had their own jobs, their own disposable income, and their own credit cards linked directly to the Epic accounts. They didn't need parental permission anymore, so Epic stretched the monetization rubber band as far as it could possibly go, testing the limits of what a player is willing to pay for a digital item. And all of this escalating extraction was happening at the exact same moment the company was firing the people who built the platform. And the timing makes the logic very clear. When corporate decisions drain the treasury, you cut workers and squeeze the players. The billionaires at the top stay comfortable either way. In September 2023, the gaming industry was hit with a devastating shockwave. Epic Games abruptly announced that they were laying off 830 employees. That was roughly 16% of their entire global workforce. To understand how shocking this was, you have to remember that Fortnite is still one of the highest grossing games on the planet. It prints money on a daily basis. So how does a company making billions of dollars suddenly need to fire nearly 1,000 people? The answer lies in an internal memo sent by Tim Sweeney himself. In the email to the staff, Sweeney admitted a glaring catastrophic truth. For a while now, we've been spending way more money than we earn, investing in the next evolution of Epic, and growing Fortnite as a metaverse-inspired ecosystem for creators. Let's unpack that sentence, because it exposes the darkest flaw in modern corporate leadership. Epic Games wasn't losing money because Fortnite was failing. Fortnite was doing great. Epic was bleeding cash because the executives were obsessed with building the metaverse. They spent heavily on Creator Economy 2.0. They spent massive amounts of capital fighting the pointless legal war against Apple. They brought up independent studios and companies at a rapid pace during the pandemic boom. And then when those unchecked investments didn't pan out, they made the devs pay the price. The layoffs were incredibly brutal. The purge severely impacted the teams at Mediatonic, the studio behind the Fall Guys, which Epic had acquired just 2 years prior. Epic bought a beloved indie studio, absorbed their IP, integrated it into the Fortnite ecosystem, and then gutted the team that built it. They also totally divested from Bandcamp, a music platform they had randomly purchased shortly before, selling it off and resulting in even more job losses. The hypocrisy of the 2023 layoffs is a bitter pill to swallow. Tim Sweeney admitted in his memo that he had long been optimistic that they could power through the transition without layoffs, but in retrospect, he said that belief was unrealistic. The CEO made unrealistic financial bets, overexpanded the company, picked fights with trillion-dollar tech giants, and lost the FTC lawsuit because of his company's illegal UI designs. Yet, Tim Sweeney kept his job. The executives kept their massive salaries. The shareholders kept their equity. The people who lost their livelihoods were the artists, the programmers, the QA testers, and the community managers who actually made the game function. These were the same workers who endured the 100-hour crunch weeks back in 2018 to build the empire in the first place. When Epic needed them to sacrifice their physical and mental health to get the Battle Royale mode off the ground, they demanded unwavering loyalty. But the moment corporate profit margins dipped, that loyalty meant absolutely nothing. The workers were discarded like pieces of trash. But if you thought the V-Buck price hikes in 2023 were bad, what Epic rolled out a few years later was even worse. By 2026, the company introduced dynamic pricing into the Fortnite ecosystem. If you aren't familiar with dynamic pricing, think of it like surge pricing when you order an Uber. Instead of a set price, the cost of V-Bucks and cosmetic items can fluctuate based on player demand. If a highly anticipated skin drops and millions of players log in to buy it, the system can automatically raise the price in real time. It takes the FOMO they built over the years and uses it against the fan base. They stopped selling digital items and started trading them like stocks, squeezing every possible cent out of their players right when they want an item the most. But all of that extra money still wasn't enough to protect the people actually making the game, because in 2026, history repeated itself. Despite all the promises they made after the 2023 cuts, Epic Games announced yet another massive wave of layoffs. This time, they fired an additional 1,000 employees. But the 2026 layoffs reached a new low when it came to corporate cruelty. One of the employees swept up in these massive cuts was actively battling cancer, and when Epic fired them, their company-sponsored health insurance was instantly cut off. Their ability to pay for medical treatments was just taken away overnight by a company worth billions of dollars. The story eventually leaked, and after a massive wave of public outrage, Epic scrambled to fix a PR nightmare and reinstated the employees' healthcare. But they didn't do it because it was the right thing to do. They did it because they got caught. The fact that a company making this much money allowed a sick employee to lose their insurance in the first place tells you absolutely everything you need to know about how Epic views its workers. Now, when you compile all of this information, a very clear, very disturbing picture begins to form. Fortnite isn't dying because of bad map design and uninteresting seasons. The soul of the game was hollowed out a long time ago. Epic Games has transitioned from a game development company into a ruthless corporation. The world of Fortnite is a carefully constructed mask. It's designed to keep you distracted, as long as you're laughing at the newest collab, or grinding the battle pass, or watching your favorite artist perform a virtual concert, you aren't thinking about the thousands of people who lost their jobs. But after everything we've covered today, the crunch, the dark patterns, the chargeback bans, the children's data, the propaganda campaign, the layoffs, the price hikes, the system designed to ensure you never truly own anything you pay for, you have to go back to the original question. Does Epic Games actually want to destroy monopolies, or are they just angry that they aren't the ones in control?